In this video, we will have a look at the marketing research process I followed when I completed my thesis, and this was based on wearables. So hopefully you can follow these 6 specific steps for your future research projects. But in essence, you should have a clear idea of how to conduct a marketing research process for any topic. Before we can get into step 1, we need to get more information as to the background of the study. So before we can have the problem identified or the opportunity identified, we need to understand how we got to this point. So in essence, the introduction and background to the study, this was a main view of the wearable device industry, which really piqued my interest at the time of this study because it was growing rapidly on a global scale, and it continues to do so even in these modern times, especially with the continuous development and improvement of technology and the incorporation into your everyday life. So I had a specific look at wearable activity tracking devices for health improvement reasons. At this stage, the wearable device industry was already a multi-billion-dollar industry, and what's specifically, it's growing exponentially on an annual basis. Even with the COVID pandemic, it is just inflaming the need for these devices to take care of your personal health. And these devices provide you with various benefits to see your stats, like your blood oxygen levels with the pulse ox, your heart rate levels, and so forth. You can also, of course, record various types of sport profiles, and there are various different levels of devices, from basic up until advanced. But in essence, this was a broad view of the several categories at the time, and then there was a limited amount of research globally, and especially in South Africa, which is a developing nation. So based on this brief background, I wanted to know, what does the wearable activity tracker, so what adoption look like in South Africa? I wanted to know, can we predict adoption intent based on what? And if that is the case, how can I improve the adoption of what in South Africa? And that brings us to the problem. So from the background of the study, the main opportunity more than a problem was that, yes, the problem was there isn't any research available, but the opportunity is there to propose and test a model of the factors that influence Generation Y students' attitude towards and intention to use wearable activity tracking devices, especially in South Africa. The reason why I chose Generation Y students is also detailed in the thesis link below, where these consumers at the time of the investigation were shown to be the most likely users of wearable activity tracking devices. And then from this main opportunity problem that was identified came the 8 objectives. So I'm trying to determine whether these students have a positive attitude towards these devices, whether they perceive it as easy to use, whether they perceive it as useful, whether brand name plays an important role in their decision, is that significant, whether relevant others, for example, subjective norm, whether that plays a role in their decision to purchase these devices, and if they have a positive intention to use these in the near future. Then also to determine if this is a 6-factor model, and then the extent to which each of the 5 factors, for example, attitude, ease of use, usefulness, brand name, and subjective norm, what the extent of these variables are in predicting the intention to use wearable activity tracking devices. Once the problem was identified, and there were several objectives, which were based on the analytical framework. So this was developing the approach has several elements. The foundational or theoretical background for this study was combining the theory of reasoned action and the technology acceptance model and extending that with brand name. Because as with all high involvement products, we usually tend to stick with a reputable brand name that we know we can trust and get value for money. From this stemmed the 8 hypotheses. These were stemmed or based on the objectives. Since the information was non-existent and to a specific problem, it was primary information that was collected, and deciding between qualitative and quantitative, I went for the bulk approach because there's a bit more responsive and to generate this model. From step 2, I had to choose a research design, and I went for descriptive research because I wanted to know more details in terms of the what, who, when, where, and how. And I also used a single cross-sectional approach, meaning that this was collected at one point in time Whereas with the longitudinal is we collect the data from the same respondents in 5 years time again. So it was just easier to collect anonymous single cross-sectional data, and this was deemed most suitable. Before we can actually get to collecting the data, we need to determine who to collect the data from and where, and this is why you need a sampling strategy. In the sampling strategy, you need to look at your target population. For this study, it was all male and female Generation Y full-time undergraduate students between the ages of 18 and 24 years, and they had to be enrolled at a South African higher education institution in the Gauteng province during 2017, because that's when the study took place. Why 18 to 24 and university students? That is also detailed in the thesis. Basically, this age category being most likely to use technology, and also combined with that they are busy completing a tertiary qualification, they have a high likelihood of getting a position or a job, and then they have higher future income potential and spending power. So it is better to get data from your future or potential customers. Then the sampling frame were the 26 higher education institutions in the country, followed by sifting this to 3 in Gauteng using a non-probability judgment sample. With the sampling method and size, again, a single cross-sectional non-probability convenience of 600 full-time undergraduate students drawn from this sample frame. So this is where and how we want to collect the data, which brings us to doing fieldwork and collecting the actual data. So from this sample, I use a self-administered questionnaire survey method. The questionnaire had a cover letter with informed consent and 3 sections, for example, getting demographic and background information to generate a sample profile, and then also the scaled items based on the theoretical framework. The questionnaire had to go through ethics approval and also validation with a pilot study before you can collect from your main, because you want to determine whether the constructs or the latent factors load as they are supposed to, whether it's reliable, and measure what they intend to measure. Then the field workers visited each of the campuses and collected data using a mole intercept type approach. So 200 questionnaires between the 3 campuses. With the data collected, you have your questionnaires. Now you have to choose software. I chose SPSS to capture the data, and then you have to number your questionnaire so that it corresponds with the data set. You also have to sift before you enter or capture your data. Sifting, in this case, if they fell outside of the country, for example, South Africa, or outside of the age category, then they were excluded from final analysis. Once you have that, you can code it. The questionnaire should be coded. For example, the table shows the demographic data were assigned A1 up until A9. There were 9 questions, in other words. Then the background information were also coded, and then the latent factors in section C received their respective codes as well. Once you captured your data, so coding and then capturing, you have to clean the data. So some of the questionnaires might not have up until 10% completed, which will also then be part of the sifting process because you will exclude those. If it's the case where you have attitudes and there are 4 questions, but 1 is missing, you can use the mean value for the other 3 questions to complete that 3rd question or 4th question. That's not a problem. If there are demographical data missing, you can't complete that. If it's more than 10%, you remove that from analysis. Once you sifted, coded, captured data cleaning, then you tabulate this. So you do a frequency analysis to see how many responses were attributed to each of the items in your data set or the questions. As I mentioned, statistical analysis, I used SPSS and AMOS for the model generation, and this was done to generate a sample profile of the Generation Y students' wearable activity tracking device attitude and intention in South Africa, and this was also used, obviously, to test the hypotheses. Several analysis procedures that were conducted: frequency analysis, mainly used for tabulation and also for generating the sample profile. So you can see how many students were aged 18, how many students were from the comprehensive university, for example, how many were from each respective province, and so forth. Next, principal components analysis, which is then a factor analysis to see whether those 6 factors load as expected, and then also remove if the loadings are not as per the required factor loading values. Then also reliability and validity analysis, descriptive statistics analysis, then also correlation analysis. Once that was completed, especially the factor analysis to see whether it loads appropriately, and the correlation analysis to see whether there is actually a statistically significant relationship between all of these factors, we went on to generate structural models to see whether this is a 6-factor model. And first you have your measurement model, and then once that confirmatory factor analysis is up to par and really adheres to all of the statistical parameters as they should, you can move along to your structural model, in this case looking like this in AMOS. And this is basically what the final model was decided upon. And in this essence, this is also testing some of the hypotheses. So now we know that that's the final model, but now we have to prepare and present the final report. And this is basically chapter 6 in the thesis. First, you start with summarizing the investigation, and then you note the main findings. So you have your sample profile, because you have to keep in mind who's going to read this investigation. If it's for a wearable activity tracking device manufacturer like Garmin, Polar, Santo, Fitbit, they would want to know what their probable sample looks like. Then your main findings in terms of the hypotheses. Now that's done, what are the actual contributions of this investigation, and then your recommendations. So this study had 16 recommendations in total, which you can have a look at. And then you have to make sure you note who this is relevant to. In this case, some of these include the wearable activity tracker manufacturers, resellers, marketing managers and practitioners, and so forth, who can benefit from this research to make informed future decisions. Then you need to note, obviously, the limitation and especially the opportunities stemming from this investigation. What else didn't you consider? The perceived cost, for example, because these are expensive devices. So now you have to start a new investigation. If you saw that one element was not significant, okay, let's have a look at a different sample and so forth. So there are various opportunities stemming from any type of investigation. And that's it. That's the 6-step research process I followed to get a snapshot and idea of predicting Generation Y students' activity tracking device, their attitudes and their adoption intent during 2017. I hope you can use this as a guideline for your research endeavor. Thank you for watching.